Okay, well, I think we can get started. So welcome everyone to the first edition of the Common Ground Book Club, Books from a Peace Building Perspective. I'm Adrienne Lemon. And before I introduce our inaugural author and guest, I want to say just a few things about the Common Ground Book Club itself. Unlike most book clubs that you may join, you don't actually have to read the book to be a member or to participate. So there will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions and share your own perspectives. And you can do that in the Zoom chat. We promise that we'll try our best to get to you. And now to our guest. Peter Coleman is a leading expert on how to bring people together across divides. And he literally wrote the book on conflict resolution, the Handbook of Conflict Resolution, to be exact. For years, Peter has studied the psychology of conflict, understanding what drives people apart and how to connect them again. He's a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at Teachers College and the Earth Institute, and director of the Morton Dutch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution. In his new book, The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, he'll be sharing more with us about it. So Peter, it's great to meet you. Tell us a little bit about the moment you realized you had to write this book.
Hi, thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Serge, for inviting me in this inaugural edition. It's great to be here. And yes, I'm happy to talk about it. I think in order to do it, I want to cue it up with this image. I'm going to play 30 seconds of a tape that hopefully you can see. Can you see that, Adrienne? Okay, I'm going to play just this. So this is Senator Patty Murray, who is the highest ranking female Democrat in the Senate. And this is an interview she did on NPR and on the NewsHour in February, talking about her experience of the Capitol riot. So just want to play this for a second.
Stay locked down. We heard loud explosions. My husband yelled at me to get down. We were lying on the floor. And all of a sudden they were in the hall. They were yelling. They were yelling that they had breached the castle. They were yelling, kill the infidels. And we heard somebody saying, we saw them, they're in one of these rooms. And they were pounding on our door and trying to open it. And my husband sat with his foot against the door, praying that it would not break in. I was not safe.
So that's just a taste of what is behind the writing of this book. You know, as by many accounts, America today is more politically polarized than we were right after the US Civil War, depending on what you're measuring, but certainly in Washington, things are that polarized, but on the ground as well in terms of measures like affective polarization and how we view the other side and how we see how extreme we view their views to be. And also just physically, we're, you know, as a country, moving away from each other. We're segregating into rural urban pockets, and we're even within cities segregating within neighborhoods so that we have as little contact as possible with the other side. I wrote this book because my sense is that we often misunderstand problems like this. And therefore the remedies that we introduce are oftentimes fall short because they're just not mindful of how really long-term and complex these problems are. So I've been studying, you know, what we call intractable conflicts or protracted social conflicts for about 30 years in terms of case studies and in the lab and doing survey research. And this particular conflict that we are in, which, you know, some would define as kind of red versus blue or, you know, progressive versus conservative, has about a 50+ year trajectory. So going back into the mid 1970s, you start to see these divisions take off, and they've been exacerbated by many things. But what is important to recognize is that this pattern that we're stuck on which is increasing as we speak, is part of what I would call a biopsychosocial structural dynamic. So it's not something that can be essentialized into any one thing. And that's, I think, part of the problem with how we understand problems like this is that science has long encouraged us to take complicated problems and break them apart and try to find the essence, try to find the key to them. And so, is it our legacy of white supremacy that is driving this? Is it our rampant inequality that's driving this? Is it the weaponization of truth and media and journalism that's driving this? Yes, but it's mostly how those things eventually can start to feed each other, and they create patterns that are bigger than us. They're cultural patterns that many young people are born into and socialized into. And it's those patterns that we need to address. And what I found when I was initially, when Donald Trump was elected, the media started to contact me because our lab studies, we have what we call the difficult conversation lab. We study divisive moral conflicts and conversations over those. And there were many attempts by media groups to simply just bring people together to talk. But they were oftentimes backfiring because the passions, the beliefs, the ideologies that are, and the loyalties really that are wrapped into these kinds of conflicts, for example, the pro and anti-Trump conflicts, are profound and deep, and they really are a challenge to the idea of contact theory, which is let's bring people together who then we can humanize one another and sort of be rational and figure things out. That doesn't happen under these conditions. And so I became concerned that a lot of the good, well-intentioned initiatives that were being offered, particularly by media organizations, to just encourage people to get together and talk, were doing more harm than good. And so what I wanted to do is write about I've studied this for decades, and there's, our research, but there's also other pockets of important research that provide evidence-based practices for what to do. So the book offers sort of two things. One is a more realistic understanding of the nature of the problem, and the other is a sense of what to do. And that's really what primarily the book is focused on. What does research on these kinds of long-term difficult conflicts and the conditions under which they change, what does that research suggest we should do in our lives and our communities today to change course?
Thanks, Peter. It's so interesting the way you've kind of put it with the conflict that is now being faced in the U.S. and how that has grown from the 70s onwards. I want to invite others to ask questions. Anything that you're hearing us talk about, please chime in with your own comment or questions that you have around these ideas. But I'll just follow up with, for me, and you actually touch on this just at the end there's a difference between polarization and toxic polarization and, the way that has evolved actually. And I'd love if you could just pull that out a little bit more for us. And where do you draw the line? What becomes toxic? What becomes, past the point of being able to sit down and have a conversation?
Well, I think the metaphor would be, it's like, whether you have a couple drinks every once in a while or whether you're an alcoholic, whether you're addicted to a certain kind of pattern. And addiction is also a biopsychosocial structural phenomenon. And so polarization is not a bad thing, particularly in a two-party system like ours. You need smart ideas from both sides kind of challenging each other. Do we focus on tradition and stability and security? Do we focus on, reform and equality and progress? We need both. And so, having smart, rational people reasonably differ and disagree on these issues and challenging one another moves our society forward. When polarization becomes toxic is when it becomes a trap. It makes us literally sick. So it makes us, so you see rises in depression, anxiety, opioid addiction, and there are multiple causes for this, but one of them is this alienation that we feel from, half the nation. So it makes us sick. It can affect our families. You know, this is what the media has been contacting me mostly about is, you know, Thanksgiving. What do you do when you want to go to Thanksgiving and you have, you know, someone who supports Trump or hates Trump at the table? How do you manage that? But it scales all the way up. So as a nation, this is what we call a first order problem, which means that if we can't get enough, if, you know, 90% of people believe in, you know, support background checks for gun control, 90%. But we still can't get enough momentum, enough political will to address the things that we agree on, let alone the profoundly different priorities we have. So it's a first order problem because we're trapped in this dynamic. It's not just us. It's not just about my attitudes or even our relationship. It is something that's bigger than us, that's fed by the entertainmentization of media, and it's fed by the right, and it's fed by foreign actors that, you know, are playing on our own tendencies around on divisiveness. So there are a lot of factors that are affecting this, and we are trapped in it. And that is a toxic state that is not sustainable, but could lose and is likely to lead to other kinds of events like we saw on January 6th.
Great, thank you, Peter. That's really helpful, and just helpful to kind of give us that understanding and where how you assess the difference between general polarization, which can be healthy, towards something like toxic polarization. We do have one question here, or one comment, so we'll unmute. I'm gonna ask this person to introduce themselves so I don't butcher anybody's name. Great. I believe that you're unmuted. I'm gonna have to say your name. Sheik, is that it? Sheik Dambad?
Shamal knows.
Okay, I was almost there.
Thank you. I really appreciate you folks doing this. I look forward to participating in them. My question is, let me preface it that I'm part of a group called, started off being called Better Angels, now calls itself Braver Angels, but it's, you know, it uses the technique of trying to bring people together who have vastly different perspectives on things. And we find in these meetings that it does lower the temperature. People get to know each other and feel better about each other. So I was a little bit taken by your notion that these things may even be counterproductive. I'm not sure that I would agree that they're counterproductive. From my perspective, the biggest problem is that it just doesn't reach the scale that it needs to have an effect on what's happening in our larger society. Would you comment on that? Is it really that bringing people together to get to know each other and at least try to listen to each other and is problematic? Or is it a matter of not bringing that to scale? And on top of all of that, if not that, then what? Then what do we do to actually lower the temperature and bring about a capacity for our society to function with some degree of mutual respect?
Thank you, great question. And I appreciate the distinction. So let me just be clear. So what many dialogue groups are organized around is something called contact theory, which we've known from the 1950s, by Gordon Allport. It is about bringing people together who don't have contact, who therefore can humanize each other. And what we know from 50 years of studying this is that there are certain conditions under which this works, right? And part of that is, you know, face-to-face contact with identification of a superordinate goal, feelings of equal power, right? So that you're not having imbalances of power in the room, and good facilitation and psychological safety. All of those things are critical. If I, like My Country Talks, which is one of the groups that originally contacted me, says to you, go on a website, answer this survey, it'll put you on one side or the other of an issue, and then we're going to match you with somebody in your neighborhood, encourage you to go off and have a beer or a cup of coffee and talk about it for an hour. Under those conditions, there is no psychological safety, there's no facilitation, there's no guidelines. It really is sort of setting people up for explosions. And what they did eventually reveal to me is, in fact, there are these stories where things backfire. So what I'm suggesting is groups like Brave Angels, in fact, understand the science under which it can be a constructive encounter for people to come together. I think that's really important. And I think they and others do very good work. So I'm not suggesting at all that dialogue groups aren't important. I'm just suggesting that we pay close attention to the conditions under which they help. But let me also say, getting to your deeper question, is that I think we're not going to talk our way out of this in small groups around the country. I mean, the good news is there are 7,000 or more groups and organizations around the country. And if you go to the Bridge Building Initiative, Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton, there's a map, US map, that you can go to that tells you where these different groups are. And these resources can be fantastic resources, and I would encourage them. But what I suggest in my analysis and in the book is that it's insufficient. What we need to do is move beyond talk. And I think many of these bridge building organizations, Hope in the Cities is one, does that. They recognize that changing the kind of attitudes and dynamics around this kind of conflict take time. So they're not one-off hour-long conversations. They take time and some kind of perseverance and commitment, and they bring people across divides together in conversation around racial differences or around political differences. And eventually the folks that stick together identify common interests, and then they get up and get to work and they focus on those things. And these kinds of groups happen not only at the community level, but they happen in sectors. They're happening, in journalism and media. They're happening in politics. They're happening in, environmentalism. There are different sectors where you have not just dialogue groups in order to, identify common ground and interesting ideas, but identify actions that group is well positioned to take on in their local community or in their sector in order to make a difference. Because we need to start to address these structural drivers that are bigger than us. And we can't do that alone. And we're not going to do that through simply understanding the other side. We need to do that through mobilization and action. So that to me is, with these kinds of problems, and let me just be clear, oftentimes contact is good, right? We've known that for decades, that contact can help. And bringing people together who don't know each other and have no contact with each other can be a great transformational moment where you feel the other is human and have children and they dance and we like the same kinds of music, and I never thought that way. Those experiences can be either transformational or even just seeds that can grow in us over time in order to promote tolerance. But when you have conflicts that are this organized and structured and passionate, they're insufficient, and we need to then move into action.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thanks for your question. Great. We have another question from Claudia, who I think we can just unmute her so she can share a little bit of what she's curious about.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adrian. And hi, Peter. Good to see you. Good to hear from you. My question is, there are some polarized opinions out there, and there's some very extreme opinions, like, for example, QAnon, some of those ideas that are, taking more and more space in the public space. Where, if anywhere, do we draw the line? Do we talk to everybody? Do we engage? Do we try to engage with everybody? And how, in particular, do we deal with the most extreme and try to bring them back into a space where we can have a conversation that is based somewhat on facts or somewhat on, how do we deal specifically with some of these more extreme perspectives? Thank you.
Yeah, great. And good to hear from you, Claudia. It's been a long time. So fantastic question. And part of what happens in times like this, when the dynamics are so extreme and intense, is that the extreme voices monopolize. So on Twitter, for example, I read recently that something like 80% of the content on Twitter comes from 3% of the population. So you have very active, very engaged people, for example, on social media that are driving the discourse. And what that tends to do is, depress the rest of us, disengage the rest of us, so the middle drops out. The good news is that the middle is exhausted and fed up and sick of this. And the studies by Moore and Coleman have shown us that there is this, what they call exhausted middle majority of individuals. Last count was something like 93% of those in the middle in the US are fed up, exhausted, and want out, want to figure out a different way to do this. So the trick is, I think, mobilizing them. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily need to certainly, listen to, conspiracy theories that are insane and irrational, and therefore give them a platform and endorse them. What I am suggesting is that with the current kinds of tension, the possibility for violence and the possibility to listen to the other side, and to start to differentiate the other side. Not everybody on the right or on the left is crazy and extreme, right? But the discourse is being controlled by them. So part of my, recommendations is that we mobilize those in the middle to re-engage and show them ways to do that. And these 7,000 groups across America are one way to find where to do that, like where to begin to engage that way. But it's really about reintroducing guardrails, right? That we have to find a way to disagree about things. People have done this for decades, and Search for Common Ground, I think, has worked around the world to encourage this, to bring back guardrails when they've fallen off, so that people do move into vitriol, villainization, and violence too often, right? So it's, how do we start to create public spaces? And the major social media platforms have a critical role to play in this, right? News reporting, journalists and major news organizations also have a critical role to play in this. So for me, it's not about accepting, irrational, insane conspiracy theories. It's about enhancing the voices in the middle, creating, allowing them to sort of take back the discourse, take back our democracy, and not have it victimized and weaponized by these more extreme voices. Colette, did I address your question, or do you have any follow-up?
Yes, thank you. No, that's really, really helpful, and lots of thoughts coming to mind, but thanks for that.
Thanks for your question.
I'd love to go over to Spain, actually, with Irene. Irene, do you want to unmute and share a little bit about your experience from Spain? And correct me if I pronounced your name wrong, please. I'm not sure if it worked. So maybe I'll just share, I think she's fallen off. So I'll just share a little bit about what she said. She said that she's from Spain, and they can see a similar kind of toxic polarization that's happening to what's happening in the US. And in fact, interconnected as people tend also are fighting over things that are happening in the US, but along the same lines in Spain. So she asks, what elements do you think are context specific, and which ones are actually being caused by global forces that are much larger than any one nation?
Well, I think it's a good question. I do think that America is a model for the world in good and bad ways. And so the influence of America, American media, American culture, American emissaries, the folks that get so much attention globally have an influence everywhere. But in addition to that, you've got places with their own history. So I've done a lot of work in the Basque region of Spain, and I know of those issues of ETA and the history of the Basque in Spain in particular, and that has its own life and its own history and its own symbolism and its own challenges. It is a place that is coming out of violent conflict and is working actively to build peace in the region. Some of those issues and dimensions map onto what's happening in the US in terms of right, left, and, wanting strong authoritarian leadership versus more inclusive leadership. So there are some themes, I think, that cut across national differences, but then there are, these deep local initiatives, local concerns, grievances, and, history of tensions that play out and may or may not tap into these larger dimensions.
Great, thanks. And then I want to go to Amani as well. Amani has a question about where at some point we have that grassroots inclusion. So maybe Amani, you want to speak a little bit about that?
Hi, yes, hi. Thank you for having me and thank you for organizing this. And thank you so much for explaining the dynamic in your country so much. I'm looking at how this kind of setup, I understand that we need grassroots movement to change things from the bottom up, but I also think that for radical change, we also need some kind of influence coming from the top. And I was wondering what best way to, set this up, because grassroots is important, but it's also slow. Obviously, because there's so many components and it's complex. And as you said, it's linked to psychology and it's linked to socio-dynamic. There's so many different elements to it, and we can't just reduce that to just chatting to each other and everything's going to be fine. I guess it takes a long time to build trust back, but at the same time we also need impetus from the top to help. So I was wondering how you would see this, like a joint effort coming together.
Great question, thank you. So, it's an interesting thing. So you're raising the issue of sort of what is the role of government or big business or these major platforms.
Yeah.
There are many things that they can do. I have been in conversation with the Biden administration for several months since they were aware that they were going to transition into power. And they've been wondering what to do and what the science suggests that they should do. And ironically, because Joe Biden, for example, is in the epicenter of this conflict, in some ways he is very constrained about what he can do. He certainly cannot make things worse, right? So our former president really weaponized division and weaponized hate and othering. And so Biden can definitely back off that and send a very different message. But any kind of, program around depolarization that they institute is immediately going to be politicized and weaponized, right?
Mm.
They're in some ways, they're very constrained about what they can do. One of the things I have recommended to them that they consider doing is what I called launching a radical listening tour. That part of the frustration of so many Americans, really on the right and the left, because this is true for Bernie supporters as well, is that they feel that, the 2007-8 economic collapse and the bailout of the banks left them behind. There's, the institutions are failing them. They're still in this kind of vortex of poverty and nobody cares. And one of the things we know is that if people feel like they're left behind, if they feel like they're in low power, then if they're really heard by their institution or by those in higher power, and that is followed up on, that it can go a long way in having an impact on those that are aggrieved from, these past circumstances. So, and because of, well, one of the things we'd recommended is with the rollout of COVID, there is this COVID vaccinations, there has been this tremendous infrastructure, this like military-like, installment of infrastructure around that. And these 15 minutes where people sit after they're vaccinated quietly. And so our recommendation was talk to people, listen to people, ask them what their concerns are, document it. And ultimately, after a year of collecting that data, use big data to go back and say, in these areas, these are the concerns we heard. In these areas, these are the concerns we heard. And this is our plan to address your needs. So that could go a long way in peace building, right? In identifying not just general grievances, but specific grievances to specific regions and locales of the country, because this is a big, diverse place. And then saying, we heard you, and this is what we recommend, or this is what we're proposing in order to address it. So that's, again, one thing that the government can do. But as you suggest, you know, like I think one of the more important things that's happened around depolarization is the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News and some of the right-wing media that were proffering the big lie about elections, right? And that lawsuit, when lawsuits are, you know, several $1 billion, they get attention and they change these actors, right? So there are, you know, macro level actions like that that can, again, kind of bring the guardrails back and can start to at least lessen the influence of disinformation campaigns. And that, as I said, can happen in different sectors and needs to happen in different sectors. You know, I'll say there was an initiative that took place over the last couple of years in the US, and this was run by a guy named, I think his name is Michael Pothauser, if I'm getting his name correct, which was an eclectic network of actors, Black Lives Matter activists, AFL-CIO, AFL, labor, you know, commerce, boards of commerce, lawyers, activists coming together and thinking strategically as a network about how to basically hold the democracy together and honor the votes, honor the electoral system, right? So it wasn't skewing one way or the other, but it was recognizing that the system was going to be played and it needed to be held onto. So that was a very intentional, strategic initiative, movement that took place over a couple of years that was very concerted, and in some ways, you know, dealt with the courts and but also dealt with the streets and activism. So it was a combination of those things. And sometimes, you know, our democracy in the US didn't just hold, it was held. It was worked actively, intentionally by groups of people that were trying to encourage Americans to honor the electoral system and honor the winner, whoever it was. So I think there is much that can be done at a macro level to ensure that the institutions that exist function as we need them to under these kinds of conditions.
Thank you so much. I really like your idea of radical listening tool. That makes complete sense to me. Thank you so much.
It's a really interesting way of combining the concept of grassroots and those power structures that exist that we've all kind of bought into, right? So really fascinating. I want to go to Shamal, who has a question around social media. So you were talking about access to information. Shamal, do you want to ask your question or make a comment?
Yeah, first of all, Peter, I'm so thrilled that you're doing this inaugural book club with us. And I actually, as you know, I actually have read the book because you shared with me that early manuscript. And I really encourage everyone who's concerned with these issues to get the way out because it draws both on practical experience and science and theory, and it's fantastic in that way. Peter, I want to ask you to go a little further and deeper on this question of the extremes versus the exhausted middle, and particularly within the context of social media. In our experience at Search, the critical sort of criteria is who has constituency. And oftentimes who has constituency may be, from an outside observer, people with fairly extreme views. But in a way, that is irrelevant to whether or not they have constituency. You have to engage. And I think there are two elements here that I want to raise and then just have you react to. One is generally people with particularly extreme views, if they're single issue folks, are going to outperform the quote unquote moderate middle. We're interested in 50 other things and may not be primarily motivated by reuniting their community or coming together or whatever it might be. And so in any setting where you have people really devoted to a particular issue, as they see it, they will have an outsized influence. And we've seen major social change efforts are usually instigated and mobilized by a fairly small constituency that is uber focused and effective. The second aspect of this is the social media age, which really empowers those who are so focused to connect with the like-minded. Even if they're only person in their community who has those views, they can connect with a few hundred others across a much broader geographic spread and be even more influential. So I think my sense is that we have to be even more serious and diligent about understanding who has constituency and how do you connect with those folks and understand the issues that are concerning to them or that they're hopeful about and mobilize in that way. How do you think about this mobilization, the necessity of mobilization, and particularly in a social media age that really empowers individuals? And at the end of the day, when it comes to conflict, is, I would say, the bottom line, kind of how it's playing out, is having a more exacerbating and polarizing impact on conflict dynamics almost everywhere than a sort of uniting or conciliatory impact. How do you think about, you know, this balance, particularly in the social media age, and what do we do about it?
So several questions, I think, within there. Let me try to take on a couple of them. So I want to point to two stories I tell in the book. So one story I tell is about 2 years ago, I was invited through Twitter to a pop-up meeting in New York City by one of the founders of you know, a big kind of community-based movement group, and they were interested in having a conversation on polarization on social media. And so I went. I'd never been invited to anything like that, particularly not on Twitter. I think I'd been on Twitter for about 2 weeks. And so I went, you know, to this meeting and walked in at noon in the Fashion District in this like meeting space, and there were about a dozen folks, and it was some of them, you know, it was, you know, you had Google and Jigsaw, and you had actually one of the founders of Facebook, and although not him, and an executive from Facebook, and then you had like tech journalists and a couple of academics, and the facilitator wrote up on the board to begin the conversation, what kind of dialogue should we be having on social media to promote a healthy virtual society? Which I thought was a fair question. And so I said, well, what do you mean by dialogue? And they said, well, first of all, there was silence. Everybody looked at me like I was insane. And I said, because most people that use the term dialogue mean debate. That's how, particularly in the West, in America, we're socialized. We're socialized to move into, particularly when it's conversations about political differences, but oftentimes any differences, we move into the game of debate, which is a game to win points and score points and win an argument, right? And so we move into this more closed cognitive process where we're listening carefully to our opponent in order to understand the flaws in their logic and weaponize them in order to win the debate. And that is a cognitive process that we are well socialized into. Many of us learned it in high school. We see it every time we watch, you know, Congress. We see it every time we watch debates and, you know, political debates. It's Law and Order. It's all over the place, right? So that's really what we think of as engagement with the other. And I said, you know, in my work, in my field of dialogue, we think about that as a fundamentally different kind of communication. Dialogue, you know, like Martin Buber would say, is a process of learning and discovery, right? So in a dialogue, I listen and ideally am heard. And I will oftentimes discover things about the other and why these things are important to them. I'll discover things about the issue that I hadn't even considered, or the complexity of an issue, and I'll discover things about myself. And so it is an opening process of discovery that is about learning and not about winning or scoring points, right? So obviously, you know, conversations will require some kind of optimal dynamic between the two, but certainly in American society, we are not trained for dialogue. We are, you know, If you go to AA meetings, you see dialogue. If you go to Quaker meetings, you hear dialogue when people stand up and share their truth. But it's not something that we share in America. So I made this distinction at this meeting of these tech giants, and there was again silence. And then the co-founder of Facebook said, "Oh, well, if that's dialogue, then there's no major platform that promotes that. That we are really promoted on social comparison, competition, contention, challenging one another. That's really what the business model of these things are." Why is that? Well, the origin stories tell us something about where these platforms started and kind of comparing, hot girls at Harvard and rating them, which was in some ways a kind of retributional act by the founder. But it taps into, outrage and addiction and competition. And this is low-hanging psychological fruit, which is highly addictive. There was a paper that came out in Science about 2 months ago that talked about how outrage triggers pleasure centers in our brain, much like heroin does. So outrage is an addictive substance, and social media has recognized it. Their business model around outrage and competition, their entire business model is organized around that. Facebook understands that. These media tech companies understand that, but they're, again, addicted to their own business model. And so they're very disinclined to change it. And others that have followed suit play the same game because look at their market share, look at their worth, right? So it is in some ways this out of control dynamic that has to be brought back into control. And so, just to quickly get back to your question, I do think that there has to be concerted pressure put on these institutes and these platforms to take a hard look at what they do. And I'm not even talking about the weaponization of Facebook, in Myanmar and elsewhere to commit genocide. I'm talking about the basic business model and how, Facebook, if you look at their motto, it is to build a better society or community or something like that. My question is, well, what kind of community are they building? They're building a community that's really about envy and competition and contention, and not about compassion and listening and discovery. And so that, half of a human experience is missing from many of these major platforms. And this was something that was recognized by this co-founder and by everybody else in the room. They kind of said, yeah, that's true. so that's in some ways the essence of the challenge in this piece of the problem. It's not our whole problem, but it definitely is a component to this problem. But there are ways to rein this in. So again, the Dominion lawsuit is an example of how when things are abused or misused, we can challenge them. But it's also, consumers are the commodity. We're following this. We're allowing ourselves to be played by these platforms. So when do we stand up and say, no, in the 70s, Ralph Nader led a consumer awareness movement to say, we are being played by these major corporations and it's not safe. Well, this isn't safe either. And I think we have the power of our attention and our resources that we could mobilize to say to these major platforms, we disengage unless you change.
Thanks, Peter. Great,
Peter. So, thinking about what you've just said, which is a lot around the power dynamics of social media, and even before that about the power dynamics of different brokers and what they can do. We have a question from Gretchen Johnson. I don't know if she wants to unmute and ask her question, but around like how we actually get people to do this. So Gretchen, do you want to share?
And this is similar to the other question, but also just to think about like how our politicians speak and just how do we ask them to just tone down this rhetoric? I've sent letters or whatever, but like, how do you actually have them, calm down a little bit?
Great question. So I have what I think is a perfect example. So I would suggest that you look up Derek Kilmer, who is a congressman from Washington State, and William Timmons, who is a congressman from South Carolina. One's Democrat, one's Republican. They co-chair something called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. And this is a group that was started just about a year and a half ago. And their intention is to try to repair Congress. They recognize that Congress is in the belly of the beast and is a major contributor to what's happening. And so what they've done, they were given a one-year mandate. They put out, I think, 98 recommendations for reforming Congress. They have been doing retreats and conflict resolution conversations and some dialogue processes, but they're really trying to look at the structure of the work of Congress and why it's so dysfunctional and so polarized and what to do about it. And a lot of what they're doing is so if you can go, they have a website for the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress that you can go to. It gives you a sense of what they're doing. And some of it, again, as I said, is not rocket science like this. One of their recommendations is on the first day, one of the people that they talked to was a coach. And the coach and Kilmer said, how do you change culture? And the coach said, you start with the youngest players and they can change the culture. So they start with the freshmen. And you know what happens when freshmen show up on day one in Congress? They're put on a Republican bus or a Democrat bus and sent off into different directions to start to plan and learn and organize. And so their first recommendation was, don't do that. don't split them up, right? Bring them together in conversation about Congress. Have sessions where it is about how do you work with the other side, like respectfully and effectively, right? So they've listed these 98 recommendations, many of which Congress has begun to adopt, and their mandate was extended for another 2 years. They were, the freshman class wrote a letter to Pelosi, and another group of well-intentioned congresspeople wrote a letter to Pelosi, and they both said, this group is helping us, please, encourage them to continue. So again, this is what I call positive deviance, right? This is actors that are swimming against the tide. They're working effectively in what is possibly the most dysfunctional institution we have around political division. And they're doing it effectively, they're doing it respectfully. Everything they do about how they work is intentional. They have true co-chairs. They split the budget equally. They have 6 members are Republican, 6 are Democrat. They have to reach majority consensus on all of their processes. So it's a very different political animal in the midst of Congress, right? So there is, my message is, Gretchen, there is hope. There are well-intentioned actors even there that are trying to change the climate. Ultimately, they recognize that, they're also being played by gerrymandering and politics as war, and the fact that Newt Gingrich changed the work week from 5 days to 3 when he was Speaker of the House, which enabled Congress people not to, or encouraged his representatives of Republicans not to move to Washington, not to bring their families, and not to have those cross-cutting ties where their families grow up together with, kids of parents across the aisle. Those kinds of cross-cutting structures are critical to bringing back the guardrails, not to having these folks, ultimately create unity, but at least to agree to disagree respectfully with one another.
Thank you. That is actually, hopeful. Thanks.
I want to take us now to our one last question from the audience, from Pry, who it wants to ask, take us out of the US context for a minute, over to Myanmar. Can you go ahead and unmute? Will that work?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good evening from me and good morning to you. So the questions as answer and they're very helpful for me, and I learned a lot. So, and bear with me, please, because I have some kind of language barrier. That's why. um, you may know that we have peace process in Myanmar. Myanmar peace process. The peace process is with between ethnic organization EAOs, the Myanmar government, the military, and there are I want to explain about uh, context before the question. So there's a key stakeholder in the peace process: ethnic organization, government, military, and the political parties. So they are especially the key stakeholder. Everybody in the peace dialogue and during the process. But there are some key stakeholder but left behind, like young people, and the civil society organization, and so this is before the military coup. Now we are under the military coup in Myanmar. So this process is before the military coup. The youth voices and CSO voices are not heard. So there are increasing frustration, and the trust to the process between young people among young people and the CSO in the country. So now and the peace process is not very much progress. So, and now on February the 2nd, 2021, the military coup happened in Myanmar. You may know that, you may heard that. So, and now there are no, I have no idea of continue it. I mean, the process. So now, but on the other hand, the one in power, the military, seems inviting the EAOs. I mean, those signs the nationwide ceasefire agreement. So seems like they're inviting, but lacking trust to them. The EAOs and the public and youth and the other parties are lacking trust to the military. So it's kind of a deadlock. So now, in the former discussion, in the former peace process, youth and CSOs and are feeling left behind and increasing frustration to the process. So in this kind of situation, they are more frustration right now. So this is the context. So and now because to be a holistic, developed country, we need to have a stable political system and the economy. So without the peace process getting done, we cannot have it. That is why, for the sake of the country development and peace, we need to have the stable political system and the some other things. So how can we bring those stakeholders and make the and and how can we bring uh, and find the entry point to start the talking, the dialogue. So this is it's kind of like two people, two people having a very high uh, climate, fighting together. So they cannot talk each other. Like so, in this kind of, they just can't uh, look at each other face. So looking at each other face, they would fight again. So in this kind of situation, how can we bring together and talk for the further dialogue and for making peace? So that is the question. Sorry for I've talked a lot, and correct me if ask me if you need more clarification. Thank you.
No, thank you for your question. Let me preface it by saying I follow events in Myanmar. I've not studied it carefully. I think I've worked there directly
Sorry, I cannot hear very well. Can you please pause?
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
So I was just going to say, my caveat is just that I have not studied Myanmar carefully, other than what I can pick up in media events. And I know this situation there is highly threatening and complex, with a long history and many actors, in the region. But let me just say this, I guess. You're asking for how to begin, and it's a fantastic question. And you're describing that even before the military takeover, that there were excluded parties that were not part of the process. I have to say, this in some ways is one of the places where social media can serve a very positive purpose, under certain conditions where it's secure, because there are groups that have done not only mobilization on social media, of young people. We've seen that for a while now. But there are groups that are being able to now encourage and promote dialogues, community level dialogues, capture those conversations and start to feed them back into, sort of themes at a more decision-making level, either at a community level or at a national level, so that leaders can become more privy to this. So there's a group I'll call out, which is at MIT. They're called the Constructive Conversations Project. It's a very interesting group. They do combine local facilitated dialogues of community members with big data science. And what they try to do, and they've done this around mayoral elections. I think they're actually involved in Boston has Walsh is moving to Washington, so Boston's going to look for a new mayor. They're involved there, but they've used these tools elsewhere. But they have the capacity to, in these facilitated dialogues, start to bring that information, use data science to tap major themes and concerns, and then feed that back into decision making, at, again, national or more local levels. So there are those kinds of tools that exist, which may enable groups that are traditionally excluded or marginalized in these kinds of peace processes to begin to have real connection. My colleague Danny Burns is a sort of a development systems person. He works in Myanmar quite a bit. They have done a lot of community-based work in order to try to encourage mobilization of community members, but bringing that information to decision makers is, a tricky thing. And this group at MIT has at least one set of tools where that becomes more possible. It's not without consequence. It has to be considered carefully. It has to be secure so that it can't be weaponized. But these are promising innovations that are happening around both dialogue and inclusion and social media, well, not social media, data science really, and the mining of these conversations, to inform leaders that, if they ignore these concerns, they ignore it at their own peril. So ultimately, if Myanmar is to move into a more inclusive governance process, it will need to listen to these groups that you believe are marginalized, particularly youth and women.
Peter Coleman, thank you so much for this talk. It's been very, very interesting and chock full of information. The book is The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. Please make sure to buy the book and read more on some of the experiences that he has to share. For now, we'll turn we're a little bit over time, so we'll turn to our CEO, Shamal Idris, for some final thoughts. Thank you again.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Peter. We are over time. I saw 30 seconds. I want to thank everyone for taking the time for this. Our perspective is that the moment for real transformation in this country, or an acceleration towards even more destructive conflict, is right now and in the coming months and few years. And so that's why we launched this series. We have not put a monthly schedule because frankly, we are waiting for content that we think really addresses the core issues rather than sort of more maybe bland calls for unity or whatever it might be. And I feel strongly that Peter's insights do precisely that. And so I have really three asks of you in addition to the one ask of buy Peter's book and share it with others. The first is to attend and share out future book club sessions. We are prioritizing people who really have an understanding of truly complex, polarized settings and understand the challenges with dialogue-only approaches or approaches that seek only federal level engagement and not local level, stickiness and relevance, et cetera. Second is to use your platforms or access you might have to venues, podcasts, whatever, to amplify the voice of people like Peter, who could influence some of the thinking and planning of those who are trying to address these issues. And third, ask people to support our efforts at Search to stand up and expand programming here in the States that addresses and precisely the kinds of dynamics that Peter noted in this session. My colleague Aaron has dropped a donate link into the chat. We encourage people to give. We are, as some of you know, vastly expanding our programming this summer. So thanks all very much. Peter, most of all, thanks to you. Fantastic book, The Way Out, and encourage everybody to pick it up.